In 1890, a little-known book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History was published. Written by an American naval officer, Alfred T. Mahan, it's this book that will be widely regarded as one of the most important books of naval strategy ever written. It's one of my favorite books, and it's really interesting to see Mahan elaborate upon what is essentially how a nation comes to achieve naval dominance. The book itself consists of a series of case studies, looking mostly at the various European wars from the 18th and 17th centuries, and I think it builds upon its case well. If you want to understand power and politics, you cannot really ignore the sea. I've made a previous video on this channel talking about how ships are underutilized in fantasy, and in this video, I want to talk about a setting that I feel really misses the mark about understanding the influence of sea power upon history, and that's A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
As is customary for these sorts of videos, I want to start with some disclaimers. I understand that A Song of Ice and Fire is a fantasy story. I'm not expecting it to be 100% realistic, and certainly don't expect it to be a perfect representation of naval combat. However, people often praise this setting for being more grounded than, say, Lord of the Rings, and I think it's worth interrogating just how true that actually is. George R. R. Martin has famously asked, what was Aragorn's tax policy? As if answering this question would enhance The Lord of the Rings. Leaving aside that the tax policies in Westeros are basically all left in the air because the realms are totally dysfunctional, I think it's worth asking some questions about the naval history of Westeros. In doing so, I think we can probably appreciate the setting for what it is, and also what it could be. In terms of this video, I'm going to break down each of these topics into their own segments. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why even care about the naval aspects of the setting? Depending on how you want to slice it, there's between 150 and 200-ish battles that are mentioned thus far in the series. The vast majority of these are land battles. Martin has talked about the difficulty of writing battle scenes before, and I think this is partially why he has not really written much about the naval aspects of his setting. It's hard to write a land battle. Most of the descriptions that we get of these battles aren't really very descriptive at all, beyond very much more than X person fought Y person, and then Y person won. Martin is not much of a military person, and that's fine. It's hard to write a land battle. It's even harder to write a naval battle if you don't have the requisite background. We're not all Drakhinifel, so I get that. But despite the reticence to write naval battles, the setting of A Song of Ice and Fire is fundamentally a water world. Look at the map of Planetos. There are large continents, yes, but look at where most of the cities are. Most of the cities are clustered on the coasts of these land masses, with the interiors being largely uninhabitable, or scattered, of course, with the ruins of previous civilizations. In the absence of things like trains, the most common type of mass transit would have to be sea travel, possibly between ports. Water's everywhere in this setting. It is foundational of military, political, and economic power of many of the nations of this setting. Water is foundational to all of this because the world is covered in water, and inland settlements are really not all that common. Think of the most important cities in the setting so far. Places like Old Town, Lannisport, King's Landing, Braavos, Pentos. They're all centers of political, economic, and military might, and they're all by the sea. If anything, that so much of the action happens on land is probably related to the unique geography of Westeros. That it's an island that also contains fertile, livable interiors, and that it's taller rather than wider. This probably facilitates the conditions that incline people to fight on the interior, as opposed to the sea. So my point here is to simply establish that there is a larger potential for the use of the sea in this setting than what we traditionally get, which is basically just that maybe there's an occasional naval battle that might be disrupted by some game changer, wildfire or dragons, and then maybe the mention of the use of ships to transport people from one place to the next. So there's a lot of ways to talk about the actual ships in the setting, but I think the most interesting aspect, at least if we're going by my viewer analytics, is to look at how naval combat works. So it's no secret that basically the warfare in Westeros is inspired by the military systems of the High to Late Middle Ages. A Song of Ice and Fire is a feudal setting. Knights on horseback in armor are going to be present, of course, but what's interesting is over the course of the story, how we see naval warfare presented. Just like in real-world medieval history, there are two types of ship that everyone uses. Galleys, which are powered by oars, and sailing ships, which are powered by sails, obviously. So why this distinction? Well, galleys are the most common type of fighting ship that you can find in the setting, for warfare, of course, and they were in the real world as well for a long time. The main advantage of a galley is that the ship can move independent of the wind. By relying on oarsmen, who in the real world were generally professionals and not slaves, a galley could propel itself in any direction at relatively decent speeds. The most common type of galley was something like the trireme, with 3 banks of oars, but people like the Carthaginians and then later the Romans frequently made use of larger ships, like the quinquireme, or even larger things, like the Ptolemaic polyremes. Although, of course, their military utility is very heavily debated. Despite this utility, galleys do have some major problems. Despite what you might think, a galley is not a very large ship, and most of the crew is made up of oarsmen, whose primary job is to row. A typical Greek trireme might have something between 150 to maybe 170 rowers, with about maybe 20 to 40 marines. That's a lot of people on a ship, and only a small percentage of them are actually there to fight. This also leads to a bigger problem: efficiency. Galleys are amazing ships, but they're severely limited by the fact that they are human-powered for the most part. Some galleys did exist with auxiliary sails, but mostly they relied on muscle power, especially for warfare. The way the ship is constructed also leaves very little room for cargo and storage, because the oar banks have to be placed on the side. The large number of crew and the relatively limited space means that galleys have short supply distances. A galley cannot remain in the water for a long period of time because it simply cannot carry enough supplies and provisions for the crew of its size. Larger galleys, with even more rowers, like a quinquireme or polyreme, compound this problem even further because their oar efficiency does not scale well up as you go. So this means that you cannot operate a galley very far from a base of resupply on land. We also know that galleys tended to be beached overnight. Due to the nature of their construction and the corrosive effect of things like shipworm, galleys couldn't be left in the water for long periods of time. In the ancient world, the accepted practice was to simply bring them onto the beach overnight. So these are the problems of real galleys in our world. In practice, we don't necessarily get details like this from the story. I've tried looking, and I couldn't really find any references to shipworm or similar things. I imagine it would exist. Planetos is full of incredibly hostile life, so you can imagine that if you sailed in the wrong waters, something quite destructive would latch itself onto your hull. It's these details like this that I think would add to the richness of the world, and that comes primarily from an understanding of how to transplant real naval details into a fictional setting. What is the naval doctrine, for example, for galleys in Westeros? Are they simply left in the water? What about ship maintenance? How does that actually affect their ability to fight? But of course, we do have some details. Like in the real world, galleys in A Song of Ice and Fire fight in the same way that galleys in our real world did. They aren't able to travel very far from shore. We know that galleys don't do well in rougher seas, which is why they were primarily limited to the Mediterranean Sea in our reality. In A Song of Ice and Fire, places like the Narrow Sea are constantly described as violent and rough, so these are not ideal conditions for a galley in any circumstances. In terms of warfare, galleys excel by virtue of the fact that you can ram them into other ships and then subsequently launch a boarding attack, which of course is then a melee battle fought on the ocean. So, of course, because there are these problems with galleys, in the real world, people thought of other ways to try and improve them, hence the creation of sailing ships. So we also see that in the setting with the creation of cogs and carracks. These are ships that are powered by sails, and they're more robust than galleys tend to be. As a result, even in ancient times, in the real world, sailing ships were often used for trade, and galleys were often used for war. But there is a problem, and it's that these types of ships are not suitable for warfare. It has to be said that naval warfare in the medieval era, which is where our story is based on, was not quite like naval warfare in antiquity. During antiquity, naval battles were massive affairs, the product of large, often massive empires that could pull upon huge amounts of resources to devote to naval warfare. For example, the Battle of Cape Economus in 256 BC might possibly be one of the largest naval battles in the history of the world, with about 700 ships fighting on both sides. By the medieval era, various social, political, and economic reasons had meant that naval forces had contracted significantly. Of course, naval tactics had not fundamentally changed from the days of ramming and boarding, but medieval kingdoms were not the Roman Empire, and they had much less money to spend on developing their navies. Naval battles were very much uncertain, and the ability to lose a very expensive and hard-to-replace fleet meant that for the majority of the medieval era, naval battles were fairly limited and rare. The issue is that while sailing ships can be very useful, especially over longer ranges, they lack the kind of advantages that had kept galleys of various types in military use for a long time. The ability to control your moment, independent of the wind, allows for ramming attacks with galleys. And sailing ships can't be precisely controlled, no matter how good your rigging is. The construction of galleys also lends itself easily to facilitating boarding actions. They are all essentially long open decks. It was the development of gunpowder and the advantages of placing miniguns on the broadside of a ship that ultimately spelled the death knell for galleys. It's important to note that galleys did tend to have guns, especially early on and in the Renaissance, but these were forward facing, as the rowers took up most of the space on the left and right side. However, if you have more guns on the side, because you don't need to have the rowers, well, you can fire more guns, and that volume of firepower will make up for whatever other deficiencies you might have. Now, there are no gunpowder weapons in the setting, at least not commonly available, so sailing ships have to compete with galleys with the exact same fundamental set of tools of war, and they do not compare as favorably. Galleys excel at ramming and boarding, which is the primary method that ships fight in that era before ranged weapons were strong enough to reliably sink ships. In this setting, we have a world full of water where trade is vital to the continued existence of many cities, and yet the primary means of warfare are galleys that cannot travel very far or safely across rough seas, and sailing ships, of course, are militarily less effective than galleys. So then you would think that there would be some kind of adaptation to these realities on the ground, or on the sea in this case, but here the story really fails us. These are just ships transplanted from history into the setting. They existed in the medieval period, and they exist here. Never mind the fact that from a naval context, there is no such thing as the Mediterranean Sea to make it all make sense. Most of Westeros is surrounded by rough ocean. Most of Essos surrounded by rough ocean. Is there any adaptation really to make the galleys better at navigating this? No. Is there any adaptation to make the sailing ships better at fighting? No, not really. This also, of course, has political implications. Nobody can really project naval power in this setting. Why? Because no one can concentrate their navy in any meaningful way beyond the limited confines of their coasts. You can't easily sail a galley fleet across the narrow sea. You'll probably lose a bunch in the attempt. But if you sent a sailing fleet, you'd be much less effective at fighting the enemy's galleys than you would be if you had just sent your own. It's quite a wacky situation, but it's far from the only one. And of course, this is a situation that is produced entirely by an adherence to a system of medieval naval warfare that has just been transplanted from history into the fantasy setting. Martin has taken the way that medieval naval warfare worked in our own world and just copied it without modifying it or adapting it to the changes of his world. Of course, we might be able to buy that a sword in Westeros is just like a sword in our world, but naval history is inextricably intertwined with culture and history. I can understand that the Valyrians didn't want to do anything with ships because they put all their eggs into the dragon basket. Why do you need a ship if you can send a dragon that can fly and set other ships on fire? But other people? Surely there would be some evolution of naval warfare beyond what has just been the norm in the medieval world for almost centuries. They don't have to invent gunpowder to innovate either. Just because gunpowder has become normalized in our world doesn't mean that it has to be the norm in a fantasy world either. Think of how many problems might be solved if the navies of Westeros were actually more developed and not just an afterthought. Like, how many invasions might be halted if the navy could actually offer anything more than a token resistance to a fleet coming to Westeros? Questions for another day, I'm sure. So, when I originally thought about making this video, it was going to be an essay about how little sense the Ironborn make. Not in the sense that they couldn't exist, but rather with the rules of the setting that they wouldn't really be a possible faction, they wouldn't make a lot of sense. Despite the scope of the video expanding, I still do think about it, and I think that a lot of the problems that I see in this setting are best represented by the Ironborn. So let's talk about them. I'm not really sure how the Ironborn are supposed to have their own navy. I have read a lot about discussions on places like Reddit about how or even if the Ironborn could get enough timber for building their navy. I suppose there are trees on the island in the past, but wood rots and wooden ships have service lives that span decades at most if you really, really take care of them. Do they trade for it? Who would sell them the lumber? Their nearest trading partners are also the people that they're most likely to predate upon. Are they stealing it? How do they get it back to their islands in longboats? I could go on, but I think you get the point. I do actually think a lot of these come from the fact that Martin doesn't really think too much about the problem of scale in his setting. It's funny, really, to think about how much flack Lord of the Rings gets for being unrealistic, but Tolkien's sense of scale is generally much better kept, but I digress. I don't think that it's super helpful to poke holes at things, like where do the Ironborn get their timber from? I mean, it's a fun question. But the thing that really gets me is that the Ironborn are supposed to be Vikings or pirates or plunderers, but many of the circumstances of them are bent around logic and reason to actually get them to serve this role in the story. So rather than developing as an organic force inside of Westeros, they just sort of are what they are, and I think that's kind of problematic, especially when you consider what historical parallels you could draw to real world pirates. So, the thing to understand about pirates is that historically, pirates did not become pirates willingly. The life of a pirate is a dangerous one, and that is even before you consider attacking another ship. Simply just being on the sea was dangerous. It's still very dangerous even today with all our modern advancements. Then, as it is now, the primary driver of piracy is deprivation. It was the economic devastation left in the wake of the destruction of Carthage and other often related civil wars that helped create the conditions for coastal communities to turn to piracy in the Mediterranean. In turn, these communities, plagued by pirates, eventually struck deals with them, becoming proto-pirate havens. But pirates can't stay pirates forever, because piracy is not a stable state of affairs. Pirates can only exist under two conditions. Firstly, the pirates have to have people to predate over, and secondly, there must not be a countervailing force that can stop them. For the civilian pirates who preyed upon the Mediterranean during antiquity, Rome would eventually come for them. Pompey, in 67 BC, would eventually lead a massive military campaign against these pirates, crushing them and stabilizing the entire sea. The Vikings, upon which the Ironborn are based, were not purely a raiding society. The term Viking probably refers to the act of taking a voyage. It later came to be associated with specific Scandinavian raids, but Vikings were just a subset of larger ethnic groups engaged in seafaring, trade, agriculture, and yes, warfare. It was the paucity of the land, being resource scarce, that drove these communities into fostering trading and then later raiding relationships with their neighbors. But the reason they were able to get away with it, and this is basically the point, is that their victims were disorganized and ill prepared to resist them. There is a reason why the first victims of the Viking raids were monasteries. They're ideal targets. They're rich, isolated, and undefended. But as time went on, their victims improved their social and military organization, and the Vikings were unable to keep up. If you think about the first attacks of the Vikings, monasteries, and then you think about them trying to attack, say, for example, a large city like York, they're only able to prevail because the actual kingdoms that supposedly control these cities are not necessarily organized and stable themselves. It became unprofitable to try and raid when the targets of your raid are well defended and hard to attack. Despite what we might think of their prowess, the Vikings were generally not professional soldiers. Once European monarchs had expanded their control of their societies and their authority especially, power began to become concentrated, and then, of course, the Viking raids largely stopped. A similar situation exists with the Ironborn in Westeros. The Ironborn live on a resource-scarce island, sure, there we go, that's a good start, and thus economic pressures would probably drive them towards raiding behavior. This is all fine and good. The problem is the response. The Iron Islands are extremely tiny in comparison to Westeros, and they're also very close to it. They're not raiding kingdoms that have loose central authority like the 8th or 9th century British Isles. They're not raiding kingdoms that are very far away from them and therefore hard to get reprisals to. They're basically raiding their neighbors. This would be like if the Irish were actually the Vikings, instead of the Danes or Scandinavians all the way across the Baltic. Yes, the rulership of the Seven Kingdoms is somewhat unstable, but we're talking about a massive settled monarchy, not a completely fragmentary collection of petty rulers. The Ironborn should not be able to compete with the economic and military organization of the rest of Westeros. They shouldn't be able to exert as much pressure as they have without a commensurate response. Remember, you cannot raid forever. Eventually, you run out of victims, or the people that you're victimizing become strong enough to resist you. They just continue to raid Westeros for decades to centuries, and somehow a mass military response is not mounted against them. The Ironborn are even able to put together a military that can stand on equal footing to the settled people of Westeros, and this, of course, from a society of people where most of the work is done by slaves, or at least a lot of the work is done by slaves, thralls they call them. That doesn't really make any sense to me. Shipbuilding is a matter of logistics, and the kinds of logistics systems that allow warships to be put in place are not sustained by bands of raiders and pirates. They're paid for by taxes. That's how you build a large war galley. That's how you have a place like, for example, Essos, where they can put war galleys into the field at least one a day. The kind of longship that the Ironborn used would, for the most part, be clearly outclassed by the actual real galleys that are used in other navies in Westeros. It's possible that when Martin says longship, he means something in a vaguer sort of way, that an Ironborn longship is not intended to be exactly like a Viking longship. But I think with all the other Viking allusions, I think that message comes across a bit muddled, if anything. In every period of history that has had pirates, pirates have never been able to demonstrate naval superiority over the navies of nations that they raided, if they were organized enough. Some of the most successful pirates, like the Barbary Corsairs for example, were only successful insofar as they attacked merchant shipping, and only merchant shipping. Once nations like the United States and Great Britain decided to pay attention to them, the pirates were unable to match the ships of the line that could be produced by those nations with actual proper logistic chains. The Barbary Corsairs were never able to build the large kinds of ships that could actually compete against the proper navies of the world. So, are the Ironborn supposed to be pirates, or are they supposed to be an actual kingdom with comparable resources to the rest of the Seven? I'm not really sure, and I feel like the stasis that they've been in only makes the situation more complicated. I think it's personally very frustrating, which is actually why I made this video. I think that the Ironborn could be expanded upon to be a much more interesting faction than what they are. Yeah, I think the facet that they have about, potentially worshipping Lovecraftian deities, I think that's pretty cool, but the actual reality of how their society functions doesn't really make any sense. Tolkien, at least the very least, he put a lot more effort into describing how the Corsairs of Umbar actually worked, what they preyed upon, how they were able to do it, why were they successful, and of course, how they were defeated. It should be noted that once the War of the Ring actually ended, the Corsairs of Umbar didn't stand long to the actual organized armies and navies of Gondor, right? In the same way that the Ironborn wouldn't really be able to stand against something like Westeros if they actually just decided to destroy them, which I'm not really sure why they wouldn't, considering that the Ironborn are raiding and they're so close by, and so on and so forth. You can see what I mean, right? It's an infinite rabbit hole that you could get into trying to understand how and why the Ironborn are existing in the setting that we've got, even though, of course, they could have just been wiped out. I think, personally, maybe there's just a bit of author bias here. Keeping the Ironborn in this setting makes for a cool faction, but of course, not necessarily a grounded one. So, conclusion time. I think that when it comes to world building, it's very easy to sit down and nitpick. I mean, I've kind of done that here. It's easy to point at things that are inconsistent, like travel times between armies as proof positive of bad world building. I'm certainly not above that myself. But I think it's easy to point out the flaws when it's not your life's work that's on display. But that being said, I do hope that I've managed to offer some interesting arguments about the deeper problems of the world building of A Song of Ice and Fire, about the lack of attention that could have been paid to enhance a story in a world where the ocean should just be oh so important, but it isn't. For decades, the naval part of fantasy world building has been largely relegated to an afterthought, and it need not be. For all the creative and interesting twists on the fantasy genre contained within A Song of Ice and Fire, there are huge parts of it that are basically just uninventive transplants from history. I hope to follow up this video with a third part, which will look at some interesting ways to add complexity to the shipbuilding in fantasy. Maybe to actually leverage fantasy for telling naval stories, rather than just having them as an afterthought. So, thank you for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe. We are ticking up towards the 1,000 mark. Hopefully we can try and get there before the end of the year. But as always, thank you again. Until the next one, take care.